Hello, I'm Jorge Gestoso. Welcome to a new program. On today's show, Venezuela after the energy sabotage. Our guest who came recently from Venezuela, Gloria La Riva, former U.S. presidential candidate and organizer with the Answer Coalition, an organization against war and racism. Gloria La Riva, a warm welcome to the program.
Thank you, Jorge, for the invitation.
Gloria, you just came a few days ago from Venezuela, and you were even living that energy sabotage. Tell us your experience.
Yes, I was in Venezuela for a month. I didn't expect to stay there that long. But on Thursday, it was more than 4 days of the sabotage. On Thursday, when it began, I was at the airport for a 7 p.m. flight. At 5 o'clock, the lights went out. I thought, okay, the airport, but then within an hour, we found out that the whole country was plunged into darkness. So what we saw in Venezuela was not just the lack of electricity, it was no telephones, no communication, no water. After the second day, there was no water because everything runs on electricity. The metro was stopped. It was very hard, and then especially because the bolivares have disappeared basically from the street. Very hard for people to find their own currency to buy with. People depend on a debit card. And therefore, without the electricity, they couldn't buy with their debit card. So there was difficulty buying food.
And that happened only in Caracas, or was a blackout all over the country?
It is said that 80% of the country was out. Of course, it was hard to find the news while we were there with the blackout. But basically, El Guri hydroelectric plant in Bolivar State provides 60% of the electricity, but it affected 80% of the country. It's now fully restored, but it took several days.
Do you believe that it was just coincidence? That who could be behind that?
Well, the government is going to provide proof to the United Nations soon, but there have been several reports in the social media since then by the government of the steps in this sabotage. And it wasn't just one, it was several, because the technicians, engineers worked very hard in the first 22 hours to restore it. They restored it on Friday at 3 p.m. and it fell again at 4 p.m. So it was a hacking, it was a cybernetic hacking from abroad into the brain, as they said, of the computerization of El Guri hydroelectric plant. That's why it could keep falling and coming back and falling, was because of the reprogramming from without and within.
President Maduro blames the U.S. for that.
Well, the U.S. is engaging in a full-out aggression, very intense one, since the inauguration of President Maduro on January 23rd. They are openly saying that they're going to overthrow him. They're openly saying, yes, we believe in the Monroe Doctrine. So this is one of the different methods of the attack on Venezuela. Economic, the sanctions, the taking over of the oil industry of Venezuela within the United States, the seizure of the gold by the Bank of England, which is acting in conjunction with the United States, Canada implying sanctions. It's a whole array of attack. Why would it not be an electrical sabotage? And in fact, right before it took place, Guaido and Marco Rubio were indicating knowledge of what was to take place.
What do you think about Guaido? What represents, who is this character?
Juan Guaido was an unknown. He is in the National Assembly, which has been declared defunct by the National Constituent Assembly in Venezuela. And he hasn't said very much, but his only power is that the U.S. confers upon him. And yet he can't really make anything happen. He declares embassies, ambassadors, nothing happens. He says, you know, he makes all these proclamations, but it doesn't stick because the power is in the state in Venezuela under President Maduro. And now even some governments are recognizing that. They were calling him the interim president. Now they're giving him other terms that recognize it's a failure. However, it's still very dangerous. The U.S. is using him as a battering ram, but it's still very dangerous what the U.S. is attempting. Now, on February 23rd, Guaidó, after 30 days, had to make something happen. So he declared that February 23rd, he would bring in humanitarian aid with the aid of the United States. First of all, it wasn't humanitarian and it wasn't aid. It was 2 truckloads, or actually 4 tractors.
You were there?
I was there in Táchira State at one of the 2 bridges that enter into Colombia. I was at the Tienditas Bridge, actually, where the more violent incident was 15 hours of battle at the Simón Bolívar Bridge in San Antonio on the other side of Cúcuta. Now, when we were there, the U.S. said that they would enter these 70 tons. And as people remarked, as the president of the Constituent Assembly, Diosdado Cabello, told us, he said, the U.S. says they'll bring in 70 tons of aid, but we bring into that region 12,000 tons of aid on a regular basis. So it was false. It was symbolic for the United States. The real objective of the U.S. aid was to try to see if they could break the unity of the military for future action against Venezuela.
It was like a test.
It was a test, and it was a failure. It was a complete failure.
Guaidó said 1 month after he self-proclaimed, whatever he proclaimed that he is, I'm going to bring truckloads of what he called humanitarian aid. So also didn't work.
It not only didn't work, but the only people who came to receive the aid were gangs of fascists. And I say that they're fascists because they came loading Molotov cocktails in Colombia at the border with the sight of the police right there.
The police from Colombia.
The Colombian police. And they were lobbing these Molotov cocktails, burning National Guards from Venezuela, and throwing rocks. There were more than 300 injuries. And I spoke to the nurses and the doctors, Venezuelan nurses and doctors, who said we treated everybody. Even the right-wingers on the Venezuelan side, they said we didn't care what their politics were. We wanted to treat them. And yet it was extremely...
And they were burning the trucks also.
Yes, and the New York Times finally reported something truthful on the issue of Venezuela on last Sunday, when they showed that, through a careful investigation, that Colombia manufactured and cut out 13 minutes of the video showing that it was the fascists who were throwing the Molotov that caused the fire of the tractor trailers, destroying them.
Quite the opposite of what they said at the very beginning, including the Secretary General of the OAS, Almagro, who went public to say that was the worst thing that happened in his life to witness the burning of humanitarian aid. Of course, was talking about the Maduro, quote-unquote, regime, the usurpador Maduro, he using words like that, when in reality was exactly the opposite. That was the people of Guaidó, the one that burned the trucks.
It is an absolutely open war of European leaders, of Luis Almagro, as you say, of Trudeau in Canada, and others, of course, the U.S. officials, not only the Trump officials, but Democrats and Republicans, who are united in repeating the Pentagon lies, because it's a Pentagon lie, and the Colombian and Brazilian leaders. And yet, with all this array against the Venezuelan Bolivarian Revolution, the people are standing strong. Of course, within the country, it's a class struggle. There's the rich, there's the people at the service of the rich, and then there's the people, the humble, the ones who have benefited from the Bolivarian Revolution.
And you were mentioning that after the blackout, you were seeing a reaction of the people in the street. What was that about?
First of all, every time the sun came out and I would go onto the street along with everybody else to go look for the food, to find the water, it was very calm. You actually would not know that there was a blackout as it was going on in the daytime. And I have all the video that I was taking of people crossing the street, walking, buying the coffee, but there were difficulties because you couldn't buy the food with a debit card with a lack of electricity. So people were finding their bolivares. It's very scarce. And yet, I think the supply of food, a massive supply of food to 6 million families, meaning about 24 million people in the country, by the government continued. then at the nighttime, by the third night, was the violence of some of what they call guarimberos, the right-wing opposition, who are using any kind of opportunity to wage violence. Well, there was pot banging and so on, but there was also disturbances in the street. And that night, before it intensified on the third night, I was outside across the street from where I was staying, and there were two National Guard youth, and they were waiting. They were not armed, but they were waiting to see what they would have to do. And I asked them, what do you think will happen? They said, we don't know, but we're afraid of what's going to happen.
And do you think that after the energy sabotage, the President Maduro ended up weakened or being stronger vis-a-vis of the political scenario of his country?
First of all, the sabotage, which pitched the country into darkness, affected everybody. And I think that there was, you could hear the right wing shouting Maduro every time that the lights went out. But I really think that people realized after the news came out that it was sabotage, that this doesn't benefit anybody. And the country came out stronger. I think Maduro came out stronger because they announced afterwards the things that they're doing to overcome. They're placing water tanks everywhere in the event of another blackout. And what took place in all the neighborhoods where the Chavistas are is that people went in the nighttime, door to door, in pitch dark, to inform people what is taking place. There was all-night meetings on the third night of the ministers, of all the government leaders, of everyone having something to do with the organization of the country to decide this is how we're going to engage in an offensive to overcome the blackouts, any future crisis. And again, the people were informed door to door. I think the government is stronger. But of course, the difficulties continue.
You believe that the U.S. is going to plan what? What is going to be next? What to expect that is going to happen?
I think more military preparation by the United States.
Military?
Yes.
They could. Do you believe that they could invade or they could attack?
Well, let's keep in mind that there have been 4 assassination attempts on President Maduro, and several against President Chavez, but definitely 4 against Maduro. Right now, the foreign minister of Russia, in a press conference with the vice...
Sergei Lavrov.
Yes, Sergei Lavrov, together with Venezuelan Vice President Delcy Rodriguez, in a press conference in Moscow a few days ago, he announced that the United States is purchasing all kinds of weapons from Eastern Europe to ship it to Colombia and Brazil, and not only to use in operations in those countries against Venezuela, but there are what are called trochas, these pathways, thousands of pathways through the jungle, informal ways to be able to enter contraband and weapons. There are paramilitaries in various parts of Venezuela. I was informed by an advisor, 2 people in the military who know that paramilitaries are being armed. And this is very, very serious. I think what is going to take place in Venezuela is an attempt by the U.S. to balkanize the country, to break up through military actions inside, because they cannot use U.S. troops directly. It would create a firestorm of opposition in Latin America. Although the U.S. is saying, the U.S. officials are saying, yes, we agree with the Monroe Doctrine. We are following the Monroe Doctrine. It's our backyard.
America for the Americans.
Yes, and it's our right to do so. The officials, Pompeo, they're all bragging about their role. Bolton is saying not only Venezuela, but Cuba and Nicaragua are next. And therefore, Venezuela is at the forefront of the defense of Latin America from the U.S. entering directly with its troops, with its overthrowing what has been progress in Latin America for 20 years and more, because we shouldn't forget the Cuban Revolution.
Tell me, what was the reaction here in the U.S. of all that political strategy of the U.S. to overthrow the Venezuelan government?
Well, first of all, I think there's many, many, many youth involved in a new movement, a new progressive movement, even socialist, in the United States, opposed to war, opposed to sanctions in any part of the world. And I think that this is an eye-opener for people. Right now, with the demonstration that took place on March 16 in Washington and Los Angeles, the one that took place in San Francisco.
And the name was Hands Off Venezuela.
U.S. Hands Off Venezuela. That was a great gathering of dozens of peace groups, social groups. In other words, I think that there is a great interest in opposing U.S. policy in Venezuela. There's also a very large movement in solidarity with Cuba, who see also the danger for Cuba if something happens to Venezuela to overthrow the government. The movement has to continue in the U.S. We have to educate ourselves. After what was announced at March 16 in Washington was an ongoing permanent campaign of education of the American people, the people of the United States, to have 70 teach-ins in as many cities as possible to educate the public that is concerned about a new U.S. openly declared aggression in Latin America.
The mass media is really helping the rhetoric that the U.S. is going to save democracy and so on and so forth?
It is an extremely hostile U.S. media that I think is directed by the Pentagon in the stories that they've been putting out for several years. First, it was to delegitimize the election of President Maduro in 2018. And then now, some of the accusations are so fantastical. I mean, outright lies. The Washington Post reported from a right-wing Venezuelan columnist in the Post who claimed that the Venezuelan military has executed 8,200 people between 2015 and 2017. It's an outright lie. But to put it in the Washington Post, and then similar accusations in the New York Times, that then newspapers across the country reprint, is a very calculated war on the minds of the people of the United States to accept whatever the U.S. does.
And on top of that, we do not hear, the ones who are here, the social achievements of the Bolivarian Revolution. For example, you have the opportunity to visit what is called the Misión Vivienda, the mission housing, 2.6 million houses being constructed, being built under the governments of Chavez and Maduro. Tell us about that.
Yes, if the people of the United States knew, as you said, that 2.6 million homes have been built, modern, new homes, at a price so low that people are completing the purchase within 1 to 2 to 3 years. It takes us 30 years if you're lucky to keep your job.
And to get a loan.
To get a loan. You're not really owning the house, the bank owns it. But anyway, in Venezuela, if people knew that these homes are being built for housing people to eliminate homelessness or the wretched conditions many people lived in, then it would belie and counter this idea that it's a collapsed economy.
Which is it?
No, I think that there's great difficulties, but I do not think it's collapsed. Certainly, the government needs to and wants to create production, domestic production, to replace the importation that it has depended on for decades, way before.
Because they were rich, they were living from the oil revenues and everything was imported.
Yes, it was a country that depended solely on oil, and so it became a culture and an economy that imported everything. I would see the products even today that Venezuela has the wealth, the resources, and the workers, the ability to produce at home.
So 2.6 million homes built to help the people that they were not having access to housing.
Not only that, but cable cars reaching up into the high mountains where people lived in very, very poor conditions.
70% of their income is invested in social programs.
Yes, 73%. Now, for example, the metro, the great extensive subway system of Caracas, is free.
Tell us two things. What you have seen in terms of human rights and jails.
Yes, I visited 4 prison units in Venezuela, in Táchira State and nearby Caracas, in Los Tecles. There I saw something that astounded me, a complete radical transformation of the prison system. They're no longer called prisoners, they're called people deprived of freedom, meaning that's not what you are, it's your condition. I saw guards unarmed inside the prison, but also the absence of violence among the prisoners themselves. There was a terrible massacre that took place in 2011 in the Rodeo prison there. And then from that moment, Chavez created what was called the Ministry of Penitentiary Service. The woman who heads it, a very courageous woman, her name is Iris Varela, she personally disarmed the prisoners inside. The prisoners used to be called open regime, where there were gangs, huge contraband operation, narco trafficking inside the prison, completely transformed.
Last 30 seconds. Are you running for president again?
I am a member of the Party for Socialism and Liberation. I was nominated as the candidate, also by other parties, and I think the PSL will decide soon whether they will run a candidate, and it's up to the party to decide who.
Gloria La Riva, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.